Evening and welcome to Intellectual Publics, coming to you from CUNY Graduate Center. This is the start of our 11th season. My name is Ken Wissaker and I host the program with PhD students Stephanie Guillet and Leslie Haynes. Tonight, we have a needed and all too timely discussion of David Eng's new book, Reparations and the Human. In recent months and days, we've seen a frightening amplification, again, of who has rights and who does not. In Gaza, on campus, in the newspaper, who is allowed to have an opinion, however violent or appalling, who can lose their job for even criticizing or recounting those opinions. From the beginning, David Eng's work has brought together the social and historical with the psychoanalytic. There's some literary in there too, I guess. In this new book, he turns to the idea of repair. Building on the reparations work of Black thought, he turns to the Transpacific, thinking about Hiroshima and the Holocaust, where we might assume we can sort out perpetrator and victim and where not, where repair might happen and where it has not. All those British fortunes built off of enslavers having to give up on enslaving, yet nothing for the enslaved. How is this kind of repair a social responsibility, like and unlike the repair of psychoanalysis? We're lucky tonight to have David along with two eminent scholars whose work combines both psychoanalysis and history, Professors Joan Scott and Michelle Stevens. I've been honored to work with David and call him a friend for much of my career at Duke University Press. David Eng is Richard L. Fisher Professor of English and Faculty Director of the Program in Asian American Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. He is the recipient of research fellowships from the Institute of Advanced Study in Princeton, the Helsinki Collegium for Advanced Studies, and the Mellon Foundation, among others. In 2016, Eng was elected an honorary member of the Institute for Psychoanalytic Research Training, Psychoanalytic Training and Research in New York City. In 2021, he was awarded the Kessler Prize from CLAGS, the Center for LGBTQ Studies at the Graduate Center, which is given to a scholar and activist who has produced a body of work that has had a significant influence on the field of LGBTQ studies. Besides this new book, he is the author of Racial Melancholia, Racial Dissociation on the Social and Psychic Lives of Asian Americans, co-authored with Shin-Hee Han, The Feeling of Kinship, Queer Liberalism and the Racialization of Intimacy, and Racial Castration, Managing Masculinity in Asian America, all those from Duke. He is co-editor with David Kazanjian of Loss, The Politics of Mourning from University of California Press, and with Alice Holm of Q&A, Queer in Asian America, a path-breaking volume from Temple back in the late 1900s. Such an important and transformational body of work. Joan Scott is Professor Emerita in the School of Social Science at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, as well as a colleague of ours at the Graduate Center. Her most recent books are On the Judgment of History and Knowledge, Power, and Academic Freedom. Just this weekend, she published a powerful and important account of her father losing his teaching job to McCarthyism and the horrible consequences of that moment on her friends and family. The piece is in Boston Review, and I couldn't recommend it more highly. Michelle Stevens is a graduate of the William Alanson White Institute of Psychiatry, Psychoanalysis and Psychology, practicing psychoanalyst, and co-director of the Chocolate Salon. She is also professor of English and Latino and Caribbean Studies at Rutgers, and the founding and executive director of Rutgers Institute for the Study of Global Racial Justice. She is the author of Skin Acts, Race Psychoanalysis and the Black Male Performer from Duke, and many articles on the intersection of race and psychoanalysis in JAPA, Contemporary Psychoanalysis, Psychoanalytic Dialogues, Psychoanalytic Quarterly, and elsewhere. Before I turn things over to Joan to get us started, a few small things. The chat is open, as you can see. Feel free to comment and to introduce yourselves. If you have a question for the speakers, please put it in the Q&A where it'll be easier for us to track. Our speakers will talk until about 7:45 Eastern Time, and then try to address as many questions as possible. Thanks again to Stephanie and Leslie for helping get things set up, and to David, Joan, and Michelle for participating, and then for all of you for being here at this very crucial time. Joan?
Thank you, and thanks for organizing this, Ken. I think it's going to be a really interesting discussion of David's book. I thought to start, we should ask David to talk a little bit about the book. You mentioned some, Ken, of what's in there, but I think for those people who haven't read it, as well as Michelle and I have, it would be useful just to for you to lay out the arguments so that people will know what we're referring to when we ask you very specific questions about it.
Sure. So let me just begin by thanking Ken and his team at Intellectual Publics, especially Stephanie Gray and Leslie Haynes, for doing all this arrangement of the Zoom online session. And then, of course, I really want to thank Joan and Michelle, who are the two smartest and best girlfriends a Gaysian can have to talk about this new book. What is the book about? So there are two signal events in modern history that changed our conception of the human being and human precarity. And that, of course, was the Holocaust and the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In their aftermath, they created an entire new regime of reparations and human rights. So before World War II, reparations formally was a state-to-state relationship. The losing state paid the winning state the costs of war. After World War II, for the first time in history, individuals and groups could make claims on sovereign states for injury and harm. So it moved from a state-to-state to an individual-to-state relationship. Although I start with the Holocaust and the atomic bombings, these two events also cleave from one another. The historiography of the Holocaust is consensual, more or less. Nazis were perpetrators and Jews were victims. But in the aftermath of the atomic bombings of Japan, there's been no historical consensus to this day on who were the victims and who were the perpetrators. So Reparations and the Human explores this cleaving and focuses specifically on a history of reparations, the human and human rights in the Cold War Transpacific by investigating three overlapping events. So the first event is the atomic bombings that ended World War II. The second is reparations for the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. And the third is the contemporary legal claims of comfort women against the Japanese Imperial Army for sexual slavery. So I want to highlight two theoretical issues in the book. The first is that we have a very robust critique today of the possibilities and limits of human rights. But in comparison, there's little critique on the issue of reparations, which are seen either as an uncontested good by progressives or as a political impossibility by conservatives. Reparations has a long history. It has a very long history, a long colonial history. And I explore that history and its emergence in the space of the Transpacific and the New World during the Age of Colonization. That's chapter 1. And then I move to reparations evolution in the Transpacific during the Age of decolonization in chapter 2. And as I said, I explore those three events. And then I end with an exploration on the history of nuclear arms production and uranium mining, which is done largely on indigenous lands, an investigation that returns me back to the New World and into our post-colonial present. That's chapter 3. So the second theoretical point that I want to make is that, as Ken mentioned, I'm a scholar of law and psychoanalysis. And Ken, thank you. I mean, I've published all of my books with you, and it's been a great affair. So, I am a scholar of both law and psychoanalysis. Reparations is a key term both in political theory and in psychoanalytic theory, but they're rarely discussed in relation to one another. In political theory, reparation is more a noun. Reparation is a payment, it's a history, it's an account that's meant to write violence into the past. In psychoanalysis, making reparation is less of a noun than a verb, right? As long as we're in human relations with one another, we're constantly aggressing each other and then choosing to repair those injuries or not to repair those injuries. And so in the book, I argue that it is those to whom we offer repair who are retroactively configured as human beings. So indeed, the act of repair creates a dividing line between those who are human deserving repair and those who are deserving no consideration. And I consider how, throughout the book, how political and psychic genealogies of reparation come together and they fall apart. And I argue that that misalignment of the two concepts, either as a noun or a verb, is nothing that we should bemoan because the misalignment actually keeps open a space for new injuries to be apprehended and for new victims to emerge. So from another perspective, in short, I might just say that the book explores the predicament of repair as the grounds for rather than the solution to violence.
Michelle, do you want to
You
jump
want
in?
me to go in first?
Sure.
Okay. So already in what you've said, there's so many different places that we could start. I'm going to pick up, right with aggression. As a psychoanalyst, right? One of the things that we're aware of, even within the psychoanalytic frame, but certainly historically, is that human beings have a lot of difficulty dealing with the issue of aggression, right? As something to be held as opposed to something to be gotten rid of. One of the things I find so fascinating about reparations and the human is it feels like you really open up, both within the space of the law and within the space of psychoanalysis, a different way of thinking about aggressivity that goes beyond the victim victimizer, perpetrator, or doer done to, as Jessica Benjamin said, that really tries to go beyond that. And in going beyond it, really raises some new questions. So, of course, I'm beginning here by thinking about what you have to say about Locke and this strange dichotomy Locke creates between the aggressor and the adversary. So I wonder if you could tell us all a little bit, just say a little bit about that, and then I'm gonna kind of go back and forth with you a little bit about why I found that I'd never heard of that. I thought it was such an interesting find, and I really think it has us rethink how we approach victim victimizer, that dichotomy.
So in the first chapter on the New World, I begin with Locke and the beginning of the Enlightenment, and I end with Klein with the dissolution of the Enlightenment. And I use these two figures, as Michelle mentions, to lay out my theory of reparations across European Enlightenment. What's really interesting about Locke is that he creates an argument. He was not just a philosopher and considered one of the three great theorists of social contract theory. He was also a colonial administrator, right? So he was the secretary to the Earl of Shaftesbury and the secretary to and helped to write the Constitution of the Carolinas. He was also invested in the slave trade and had property in the New World. So he also both theorized the rights of man, but also practice the problem of the rights of man in the New World. And what I argue there is that he actually creates reparations has two bodies in Locke. So in Europe, reparations actually serves as a check against the absolute authority of the monarchs, right? He's writing in the wake of the English Restoration, the Stuart monarchy, and he wants to limit the rights of the absolute monarch to impinge upon the rights of the citizen. Conversely, in the space of the New World, reparations is not about limiting, right, the violations of the colonists and the settlers. It actually provides an alibi for the redistribution of property and the taking of life that's limitless in the name of justice. So when people think about Locke, they often turn to his theories of property. But if you look at his treatises, actually reparation is all over them, especially in chapter 6 and in chapter 16. And now chapter 2 is and 16. Chapter 5 is on property. And what you see there is the way in which reparation functions as an alibi. Okay, and so Locke doesn't talk about victim and perpetrator. Locke talks about this transaction as the aggressor and the adversary. And I think that's where you're picking it up, Michelle, like that. There's a kind of built-in aggressivity in Locke and aggressivity in psychoanalysis that's worth commenting on. And so what you see in Locke is that the aggressor is always the Indian who is aggressing the colonists, who is defending his life and property as an adversary. And what I find interesting about the problem of adversary and aggressor, and let's say victim and perpetrator, is that they sometimes align and they sometimes fall apart. In victim and perpetrator, there is this disavowal of violence, right? So we get this idea that a victim is someone who is innocent, someone who does not engage in violence, right? And a perpetrator is someone who is aggressive, who has harmed the other without justification. The adversary aggressor model actually doesn't do that, right? The adversary aggressor model both is predicated on acknowledging, right, aggressivity in the individual. And so I'm just really curious, to think about what that does for our discussions, not just of the fact that, as you said, we do not, we disavow rather than hold aggression. But what does that conversation do to make us understand that in all of the political conflicts that we see from Locke's time up until our present to the war in Gaza, how do we understand the way in which violence is mediated as either justified or unjustified? How do we think of defense and violence as a response, as a defense, as justified, and actually, to go back to the legal problem, how that's written under the name of justice?
Yeah. So where you brought in Klein, and what I found very moving as I was reading through what you just described, is that it forces us to think about what we are defending, right? So when you have to think about the adversary-aggressor dichotomy, and you have to hold that, oh, in both cases, violence is being enacted, right? And so it's more than how is violence being defended as opposed to disavowed, right? That it's in the defense of home, it's in the defense of community, it's in the defense of all of these things that we hold as kind of separate from violence, right? And that was what I thought was so interesting about what you did with Klein on repair, because it was a very subtle find that you found, which is that when Klein was imagining reparations in the New World context, she was very explicit that the reparations can only happen within one community. The colonists, in order to repair the tragedy and the violence and everything that had happened with their settlement of the New World, they were going to have to build a community, a repairing, healing community for themselves, but only with their kin, right? And so, and it was a kind of throwaway comment, but as you and I have talked about, it really raised for me the question of the unthought other. So how was the Native American who fits on the side of the aggressor, the subject who fits on the side of the aggressor, how are they being thought about? And I thought your, framing of who is allowed or who is seen as deserving of repair or not, as that links with how we think about home and where we belong and what we defend, these, I think it complicates how we think. It puts us back in the messiness of violence in a way that sometimes, perpetrator, doer, done to, kind of cleaves and simplifies, right? So that was, for me, what was so interesting about the way you brought in Klein on repair.
Thank you so much, Michelle. I mean, whenever I talk with Michelle and Joan, I feel like we just generate new ideas. Like, we don't have to talk about a book, we just like generate new ideas together. And I mean, we're doing that now because what you said, Michelle, is so insightful and right. The situation that we find ourselves in Locke's time and in our time is not the disavowal of violence, but how violence is defended, how it's justified, and how that justification, in fact, creates a kind of innocence precisely through the closing off of others. Okay, so in Klein, you know, what we see, and people don't think of Klein as involved in colonial politics, but, you know, if you read Love, Guilt, and Reparation, her treatise on the problem of repair carefully in the way that we all have, then you actually see that there's a colonial history in Klein. You know, she says we paint the other in the darkest colors, right? And she says in this passage on reparation that what the colonist is doing is looking for a new motherland, right? The colonist is being driven out by brothers and sisters of the same tribe. They go to the new world, they create havoc, they injure the native other. But the reparation, she says, however, is not given to the native other, it's given to brothers and sisters of the same tribe. And that actually is something that completely writes out the figure of the injured Indian, right? And so what happens in Klein that you don't quite see in Locke is that there is a complete closed circuit, psychic circuit of injury and repair, which is to say the colonist is both the perpetrator of violence, but also the exceptional subject deserving of repair, not the Indian, right? And so it really is about the way in which a kind of liberal guilt emerges through the erasure of the Indian and through the colonizing of the suffering of the Indian. And so, you know, what I think is key here is the way in which mother becomes motherland. And certainly we see that in the politics of immigration today and nationalism and belonging. Who is considered part of the motherland and who is not? In a nation of immigrants, what does it mean that we have that something like immigration and naturalization has become Department of Homeland Security? My late and great colleague, Amy Kaplan, who was also your colleague, Michelle, right? She wrote in the wake of 9/11 this amazing essay on Homeland Insecurities. And she said, you know, we have to understand that changing border control from immigration and naturalization services, like we're a land of immigrants, to Homeland Security constitutes the United States as the homeland and actually obviates the idea that all of us have multiple homelands, that all of us have come from other places. And so there you see in the real politic of the way in which the dynamic of violence that you're teasing out and we're talking about gets played out in the politics of nationalism and belonging.
So just to follow up on this discussion, David, I think one of the interesting things to me about the whole book is the way in which you expose the different ways in which reparations or repair have been thought, and you expose the limits of what is possible within all of that. But then for your own kind of argument, I think it's on page 119, you say ultimately, if injury is not reparable and only relationships are, and then you talk about the Satu Dene's apology to the Japanese for their having mined the uranium that was used in the bomb. I felt like that was your response to everything that you've set up all the way through. I thought the analysis of trauma was really fascinating, the sort of legal and psychoanalytic notions of who is traumatized and who not in these things. But it was if injury is not reparable and only relationships are, was, I thought, your answer to what you've been criticizing all the way through. And I just wondered if you could talk about that a little bit more.
I mean, Joan, one of the things that I say earlier is that we cannot confuse a history of reparations either in political theory or in psychoanalytic theory with the ethics of repair. And I think that that statement is tied into the issue that you're bringing up now. So the book itself, in each of the chapters, I look at three key words: repair in chapter 1, trauma in chapter 2, and sovereignty in chapter 3. All of these key words actually make up the liberal political fabric under which we live and toil today, okay? And the chapters actually are called Beyond Repair, Beyond Trauma, Beyond Sovereignty. And that last chapter on the Satu Dene really is meant to emphasize what and how we might respond as individuals in relationships to one another. And so for those who haven't read the book, when I started to do the research on the atomic bombings, invariably I had to start doing research on the history of uranium mining and on nuclear arms production. And I actually started this project way back when, like 10 years ago, at the Institute for Advanced Study, which is the home, right, of Oppenheimer and Manhattan Project. So as I was doing that research, I came to discover that the majority of the world's uranium supply is mined from indigenous lands, and that the uranium for the Manhattan Project came from three places: the Belgian Congo, Southwest the United States, the Navajo Nation, and Northwest Canada, which is the Satu Dene region by Great Bear Lake. The Satu Dene men worked as quote unquote coolies. They helped to mine and transport the ore. They all died of cancer and the high rates of malignancy in the community. The mine operated from the 30s until the 60s when it was shuttered. It wasn't until several decades later that the Satu Dene learned about what their mining efforts were being put to. And when they learned that the uranium was used for the atomic bombs dropped on Japan, they felt so implicated that they sent a delegation to Hiroshima to apologize. And so I came across this story and a documentary by Peter Blow called Village of Widows, which recounts the story. And I was quite taken with it because I was like, oh, you know, these are the people who could actually claim to be the most victimized in what people call this atomic highway, the atom, you know, the highway of the atom. But yet they're not saying that we're victims. They're saying that we are perpetrators. And so that was to be fascinating. And then they go to Japan and they address the hibakusha, the people who are survivors of the atomic bomb. And they not only address Japanese hibakusha, but they address Korean Zainichi hibakusha. So of course, in Hiroshima, which was in the South, which was a major military industrial complex, there were a lot of conscripted colonial laborers. 700,000 colonial laborers from Korea worked in Japan, building armaments and material and ships. And they too suffered from the harms of radiation poisoning. And so they go to Hibakusha Hospital and they address them and they give an account of themselves. And I think that's where, you know, you're putting pressure on the way we can't repair injuries. Injuries are injuries, right? We can only repair relationships with one another. And I think in that sense, even though this is a huge political landscape, the psychoanalytic question of the history, you know, the subject of history versus the history of the subject is so key here because they address each other. And I think there you really get an example of the way in which to move beyond the refusal of the state and state sovereignty to apologize, to pay redress, what Derrida would call, you know, a kind of political calculation of apology and forgiveness. They short circuit that. And that's what I mean by thinking of solutions that are beyond the state, beyond sovereignty. And to go back to our discussion with Michelle and Klein, what I find really fascinating is it's not just that those to whom repair are offered become human. In psychoanalysis, you know, the act of reparation draws that dividing line between the human and the inhuman. It also draws a dividing line between what she would describe as a good object and a bad object. Right. So it's not that you aggress, you know, an object and then you repair it. It's like in repairing it, you also create the dividing line of that which you would constitute, that object you would constitute as good, worthy of repair, and that object that you would constitute as bad and that you would leave, in the trenches of World War One. Like this goes back to my reading of Fort Da. Like Fort Da, when the child pulls the spindle back and says, Dawn is happy, that's the mother. When he says, go to the front, he throws away the spindle and says, go to the front. That's the father who's at the front, right? So Freud reads it as an Oedipal drama, but I read it precisely as that division of those people who are worthy of attention and care and repair and those who are not. And this is not just a gender drama, it's a colonial drama, it's a racial drama. And so the end is really about how do these two bad subjects address each other, right? It's not just beyond sovereignty. It's about how do bad objects who are forgotten by the state, how do they fix their relationships? Anyway, sorry, I'm not going on, but
No,
I'll be very excited, Joan Scott.
I am, because it leads exactly to then Michelle, I'll let you talk too, but
No, go.
on page 117, you talk about the transformation of the Japanese into for bad objects and then good. I mean, it's when the apology happens, and then you say, this reification of Japanese victimhood in the wake of atomic devastation transforms the Japanese enemy and the bad object, borrowing from psychoanalytic terminology of the previous chapter, into Japanese friend and good object, worthy of US, and it's US at this point, US rehabilitation and repair. And I thought that was one of the moves that I really admired as you did your reading of these things, that you make us watch this happen. This is the historian in me, I think, rather than the person interested in psychoanalysis, watching how in the stuff that you're describing, and the speech to the peace committee and the guys coming to apologize, how that bad good object gets transformed. So they're not absolutes. You've got a historical moment in which there's a transformation that says something about the immutability of the good, the bad object. I'm not sure if I'm making myself clear.
No, you are. And you know what I would say then, Joan, is that I want to actually clarify two moves, which is one, as you said, the immutability of good and bad, which is untrue, right? I mean, bad objects can be transformed into good objects can be transformed into bad objects. That is so historically contingent. And so there are two moves. In chapter 2, when I discuss the Nuremberg trials and the International Military Tribunal of the Far East, the Tokyo War tribunals, I really talk about how is it that Japan went from inhuman enemy and kamikaze, divine emperor, and fanatics
And yellow peril. I mean,
the yellow peril to humans worthy of attention and repair. And there, what happens is that transformation is in part due to a number of military imperatives and economic imperatives, which is that right after the atomic bombings, Japan needed to be constituted as a bulwark against the spread of communism in East Asia. But it's also a cultural project. And I there focus on literature and also reportage. So one of the big pieces that I look at is John Hersey's Hiroshima, which was published in the New Yorker. It was the first and only essay that went from cover to cover. It went, in our lingo today, viral. It was read on the evening news. It was translated into dozens of languages. It's still in print today. And what Hersey, who was a war correspondent in China, he was sent by the New Yorker to Japan to interview survivors of the atomic bomb. He focuses on 6 of them, none of them military, all civilians, doctors, clergymen, Japanese people, and white people. And it's a massive resignification project through identification, which is to say, you can only repair those people with whom you identify. And Klein says, we're not going to give up our own interests and differences, but for the fact that we can identify with the other. And I think that that's the problem that we're facing today. Like politics are so polarized that there's no identification with the other. And so that project happens as a state to state project, right? So you could say that the transformation of a bad object into a good object is not necessarily a good thing to core, right? The transformation of a bad object into a good object, you have to ask, like, why? What are the effects of that? What are the political ramifications? So I would mark that problematic in the space of post-war Japan and its rehabilitation by MacArthur, with the Denes addressing, let's say, of the Korean hibakusha. Those are the figures, the non-citizens. Even to this day, Zainichis are not considered citizens of Japan. They have second-class status. They're considered, permanent residents. What does it mean for those two bad objects who have no state recognition, nonetheless, to engage in a relationship and an ethics of repair?
David, let me bring you back to the psychoanalytic, but with full historical infusion, just as Joan was infusing history with the psychoanalytic, right? There's two things that I'm thinking about. One is kind of at the beginning of the story, and one is at the end of the story. I want to go to the beginning of the story. You said something about a cleaving, I can't remember exactly what it was. You were talking about two bad objects talking, right? And one of the things that I have always found helpful and interesting about your work is that I think the reading you do of Klein, for example, identifies that this cleaving of the human is an originary split that shapes the psychoanalytic field in ways that the field has not fully engaged with, right? And so if you think now in Reparations and the Human, you frame that in terms of the liberal subject, but I think part of the conversation that we have had over the years is that the turn to the sexual, shifts attention away from a certain kind of understanding of the human that is embedded within psychoanalysis, that involves certain splits, certain otherings that are kind of invisible, right? And it doesn't mean that the psychoanalytic project isn't richly engaging with a certain kind of subjectivity, but there's a gap. There's something that's foreclosed. There's something that's missing. And for me, you're getting at reparations as a way of splitting how we think about the human, creating a bad object that cannot be thought about, for me is very profound for thinking about the psychoanalytic project, right? The bad objects kind of within the psyche, but within the field also. So that's what I meant by going back to the beginning. I feel like there is in this notion of the cleavage of the human, there is something that you are saying to the field, to psychoanalytic notions of the subject. I think it's there also in your subject of history and the history of the subject that I wondered if you wanted to say a little more about.
Yeah, I mean, Michelle, I think here you and I have to have a longer conversation about the various ways of thinking the unthought subject. So Michelle's new work is all about those subjects who remain unthought in not just history, but in psychoanalysis. And, Michelle and I have been in conversation for a long time about the clinic and the problem of race. And a while back, Shinhee Han and I, who co-wrote Racial Melancholia, Racial Dissociation, we watched Beef, the Netflix series, which blew our mind. And so we didn't want to really write anything, but then we were like, oh, we have to write about all this anger and rage that we feel. And so wrote an essay, and Michelle responded to that. Both of us talk about Audre Lorde. And so, I have to read this passage from Michelle's response because it's so moving. Audre Lorde writes a letter to her therapist named Leora, and she says, "Dear Leora, for two Black women to enter an analytic or therapeutic relationship means beginning an essentially uncharted and insecure journey. There are no prototypes, no models, no objectively accessible body of experience other than ourselves by which to examine the specific dynamics of our interactions as Black women. Yet this interaction can affect all the other psychic matter attended profoundly, because neither of us is male nor white. We belong to a group of human beings that has not been thought worthy of that kind of study. So we have only who we are. So, Michelle and I have talked a lot about that passage, and that really is, Michelle says that Lord and her therapist Leora are each other's unthought subjects. And so, on that micro level, it introduces this problem of the unthought in not just psychoanalysis, but in history. And if I were to scale up that clinical scene to the problem of reparations, I would say that reparation, in some ways functions as a heuristic in this book for the problem of the unthought, both in history and in psychoanalysis. And that really goes back to what I was saying, which is that reparation and repair is the ground for, rather than the solution to, violence. Because in my reading of repair, whether it's in Locke or Klein, repair creates a dividing line that justifies and in the name of justice, defends violence against the other, right? And also defends repair for some, right? While defending violence for others. And I think that that's a big idea, Michelle. And to say, like, actually, our thought of human and human rights, which we've critiqued, our thought of reparations, we've turned to reparations today in the United States because we fully understand that the project of civil rights is bankrupt, right? It's hit a brick wall. It's done a certain amount of work, but we're in a colorblind moment where so much of that work is being undone in the political realm. And so we've rightly turned to the problem of economic justice, right? And reparations. But the problem is we cannot think of reparations as outside of history. And this conversation is making us understand that one of the key words in political theory that's emerging in the contemporary scene is something that we really need to historicize. And I think the good and bad object and the unthought subject, whether we want to think about that as psychoanalytic or as historical, is an in to that. I don't know if you have any, response to that, Michelle, but I just feel like I'm kind of scratching the tip of the iceberg. But I also think that, you quote in that response Sylvia Wynter, where she talks about auto-institution, the narratives that we tell ourselves, but the narratives that are profoundly obscured. And that obscuring happens both on the side of good objects and on the side of bad objects. So the unthought is not just, it's not like, oh, good objects have all these great thoughts and bad objects are unthought. The unthought actually is functioning on both sides. And to me, that's a real conundrum. I don't have any answer for that. I wonder if you have some way to think or respond.
Well, I think too. So first, just to underscore what you just said, and then the second is going to be to take us to apology and actually the question that Joan asked you about too. To underscore what you just said, both the good and the bad object have areas of the unthought. I think that is exactly right, and is a part of what your work, not just Reparations of the Human, but other works, has been interested in. It's why you became so interested in dissociation. It reminds me, for example, so interpersonal psychoanalysts who read Harry Sachs Sullivan talked about we carry good me's, bad me's, and not me's. And often we think about race as operating in the realm of the bad me, right? That good me, bad me dichotomy can also cover victim versus victimizer, et cetera, right? But Sullivan drew our attention to the not me, that much more dangerous psychotic forces sit in the space of the unthought, because the unthought is a set of emotions and affects and feelings and justifications and unformulated, motivations that are a kind of tangle that people start to act out, right, in ways that they're not even fully aware of, right? It's a very, very complex terrain. It's a terrain that is filled with anxiety, homeland insecurities, massive amounts of insecurity, right? All of the dark stuff that sits under the good me, right? That our good me's in a way, the good me, bad me dichotomy, it just kind of, it keeps something stable. And the not me is what destabilizes destabilizes that, right? And you're making the move of saying that repair can actually be the ground of violence, is a similarly destabilizing move. It reveals something that we haven't wanted to see, right? And so that's that piece. The piece that what I found so powerful about the concept of absolute apology and what you just shared with everyone is the being able to hold. So when two bad objects are meeting, they are actually in holding not just the good me and the bad me, but like all the other unthought motivations that are like, how do you even put into words your place as an indigenous subject whose ancestors were harmed by the uranium mining and yet is offering an apology to other? How do you even put into words what that action is, right? You gave it the frame of an absolute apology, an apology for something that you can't even apologize for, right? That form of relationality, it asks something almost superhuman. But I think what was so helpful is that you providing us with a historical example of it rooted in relationship provided a kind of path, right, for where one tries to get to when you it's the word, live out in an experiential relation all of these dimensions of the subject, the good, the bad, and the things that don't want to be faced, right? And that's what they're doing in that moment, is they are facing what almost cannot be faced in offering that apology, right? So that was a powerful way for you to, a powerful case in a sense for you to offer us.
You know, when you just said that, Michelle, it actually made me think that your reading of Leora and Lord, her therapist, is the reading of the Satu Dene with the Korean Hibakosha. They're two unthought subjects facing one another and addressing one another. And I think that it is, those examples that point us to the problem of how do you take responsibility when you're not responsible? How do you recognize the other when there's no social structure for that recognition? And the question then of the good me, the bad me, and the not me, I think what I would want to do, and I don't think we're going to be able to do it tonight, is to think the not me, that unthought area, in relation to violence. Because, I do think that it's the unconscious and unacknowledged violence, projections, paranoia that emerge, from that area that might be tied into our earlier conversation about the way in which people dig their heels in and believe they're fully justified, in their violence. And this actually makes me think a little bit, Joan, of not just I talk a lot about Joan's judgment of history in relation to the Holocaust, right? It's the paradigmatic example of the judgment of history and the belief that, history bends toward the arc of justice. But you say something in that Boston Review piece, Joan, where you said, unlike this prior moment or even the moment of the 50s, you don't believe that our prior moment is bending toward the arc of justice. And I found that really, really upsetting and disturbing. So I don't know, if that's tied into this idea that, Michelle and I are talking about, because I do feel like you raised this question at the very beginning of, is this a response to all the problems that we see, the catastrophe after catastrophe building up over this Enlightenment period? And I said, yeah, in a way it really is. And it's one that moves beyond sovereignty. I don't know, is there a way to think about that moving beyond sovereignty? And the way in which you could say with the Satu Dene, the arc of justice kind of confronts you unexpectedly, like a revolution, like a surprise, right? Apologizing for that which you are not quite responsible. I don't know how to think about that in terms of our present moment.
Well, this is where the critique, which I don't share, of psychoanalysis becomes a problem to sort of think this, because what the Satu Dene are doing is as you say, is outside the sovereignty of nation states, who are the powerful enactors of the kinds of reparations and the kinds of apologies which are we think of as empty apologies. I mean, the apology to the intern Japanese that the president of the United States apologizes or gives them each $20,000 who are the survivors. I mean, that in your rendering of it, and I think rightly, is the kind of empty recognition. Yes, they're restored to being human, but kind of after the fact and without really taking into account the kind of violent history that represents, and that supposedly finishes it. That's done. And so my sense is that the Satu Dene story, this is where the sort of my pessimism, I think, comes into it, is a terrific example of what you're trying to argue. But what I don't see is how that then sort of has an impact in terms of changing the dynamic that you're so critical of. That is, it's a beautiful example of relationships rather than notions of repair, the thing that I raised earlier, that your statement about it. But it doesn't, for me, it doesn't answer the sort of historical question of what is this going to do for the structures within which we live. I mean, one of the things, you have that terrific, on page 67, when you talk about the US intelligence reviews in 1945, talking about the deployment of strategic air power in Japan, reads in all capital letters. I mean, it reminds us of what we're dealing with now in all capital letters. There are no civilians in Japan. And I kept thinking, that's Israel and Gaza, right? There are no civilians in Gaza. There's just Hamas terrorists. And that's the justification for, and the Israelis then become not the perpetrators, but the victims. They are nothing but victims. And the Gazans, who are in fact their victims, become the perpetrators. And so what's the, how we can analyze that, but how does the story of the denouement point us in a direction which is hopeful? Because you're saying that, reading my comments in the Boston Review thing, that I used to believe that, the good guys were going to win, and I don't anymore. How do you answer my sort of pessimistic reading of that and saying that's all very well, and it's a beautiful example of the way in which your psychoanalytic reading offers us a different notion of what repair and the relationality of repair, and Michelle, what you've been talking about is the sort of aggression in all of us, in a sense, or the recognition of the aggression in all. What does that do for our thinking about how historical change happens? I mean, I think that for me is the troubling question about the fabulous. I mean, David, I remember when you first found out about the denouement thing. I think you were here, and you were so excited you couldn't stop talking about it. And I remember being utterly captivated by it. I mean, you're an enthusiastic person anyway, but you found this history and you couldn't stop talking about it at the lunch table, whenever you could get anybody to listen. And I was totally captivated too. But my problem is the one I just raised, is, what does that tell us about the way in which long-term change can actually happen?
Yeah. Okay,
David,
Joan. So
before
that's
you
the
answer,
question I asked you, and now you're like turning it around and asking me.
Isn't that what shrinks always do?
It's like protection and reversal.
Right.
I think that one thing about history, of course, which we all hope for, is this progress. And all of us, are not liberal Enlightenment historians and theorists. We know that history is cyclical. So in the same way that we want to think like this is not.
I don't think it's cyclical, by the way. I don't think, I think it's just contingent in ways that we can't explain.
Okay, so maybe we can say contingent is a better word than cyclical, but we could say that, in moments of hopelessness, there will be contingent
right, things that emerge that will change things.
Of hopefulness, okay?
Right.
And I think that the Dene is one of those kind of contingent moments, and that's probably what led to my exuberance at the lunch table, because when you think about this history of reparations and colonial conquest and the atomic bombing and the Holocaust, these are not fun things, right? What I would say about Satya Dene is that today these are impoverished communities with no resources, no education, high incidences of malignancy. The subsequent generations have had no recourse but to reopen the uranium mines. Right. So post 9/11, uranium mining has skyrocketed again. And that is their major source of income. So, I also try to, say in this third chapter is that this is a contingent historical example. And it brings us back to the idea of reparation as a verb, which is that in the same way that maybe we should say contingency as rather than circularity, right? That the verb actually makes us understand that as long as we continue to be in these relationships with one another, as aggressive as they might be, there might be new forms of address, recognition, and repair that we don't at all anticipate. And in that sense, that chapter, I turn to Derrida's notion of absolute forgiveness to sketch out absolute apology. And he says that this dynamic is like a revolution. It comes out of nowhere, it surprises us. So I guess that the only hopeful thing that I could say is that these things are going on, right? It is our job to actually to 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 witness them. It's our job to promote them.
Yeah.
And that to me is probably the best that we can do given the contemporary circumstances that we face.
Can I want to add something to pull something out that I think would be a feature of this hopefulness, right? What the Satudene story, why I think I like that you shifted from forgiveness to apology is that the act of apology requires a certain degree of self-reflection. You also referenced it when you talked about implication. Now, there are degrees, they're not only degrees of the degree to which one is implicated, but the degree to which one can think about one's implication, right? So this is all malleable and contingent. But I wanted to, forgiveness has a little bit of the directionality of this is about the other, right? But what I liked about what moved me about absolute apology and moved me about the almost impossible position they were holding is that they had to reflect on themselves as subjects of history.
Yeah.
As in a way in which they were responsible for something they were not. And that move, I think, is very important psychoanalytically and clinically and historically, right? Now, that said, I think it's possible at different times. So for me, some of what maybe fuels the contingency is something about when is it possible? When is space opened up for that kind of some form of self-reflectivity, some form of discussion of implication, and when does space close for that, right? And you used a great phrase before. You said there was no social structure. There's no social structure that could recognize what they did. So that's partly what, in a certain, it bobs and weaves, right? When the space opens up, I think that's a part of the hopefulness and a part of the contingency. At least that's what moved me.
There was no such social structure, but yet they did it.
Yeah, and I think that's really helpful, Michelle, too, that in fact, thinking about the spaces opening and closing and our role as pointing to that fact, that we have to look for those spaces.
Yeah.
I also say that in relation to what you just raised, especially in the context of Gaza, where you have an eternal victim,
Right.
Jews, and you have an eternal perpetrator, Muslims.
Right.
That what you see also in the Dene saying, we take responsibility, we apologize without asking for forgiveness, right? I mean, that's the key thing,
Right.
right? You have to apologize without demanding forgiveness. You have to forgive without demanding apology. Is that in law, right? And in the political discourse that we have today, there's only one victim and one perpetrator. But in psychoanalysis, there are multiple victims and perpetrators. That victim and perpetrator might be a legal discourse of good and bad, a moral discourse, right? But the issue of harm and trauma and repair is Catholic. Like everybody can be traumatized, right? Everybody can potentially address the other. Everybody can be dependent and susceptible to the other if they so choose to see it in that way. And so one of the things that I argue in the book is, law and psychoanalysis work in tandem because today to be a victim, you need to be traumatized, and psychoanalysis is the primary vocabulary of trauma. But that also they cleave from one another precisely because anybody can be traumatized. You don't have to be a victim or a perpetrator. But if you put that together with the Satu Dene, they're actually saying we're both victims and perpetrators. We're both, responsible for harm, but we're also recipients of harm.
Right.
And I think to actually denaturalize those strong boundaries in the polarizing politics of both not just individuals, but groups today, that's an insight actually that we get from them that we can bring to other places.
Yeah, no, I think that's, I agree. I absolutely agree about that. Yeah.
David, I have another question I wanted to get back to you about, which was the kind of colonial framework. When you first started your description of the book, you were putting forward these two very strong historical moments in the 20th century. And I wanted, it's a kind of broad question, but I wondered how, what your thoughts are about they have a specificity in the 20th century in terms of law, international law, but they have a kind of way of operating, a way of thinking about violence, all these dynamics that we've been discussing that are linked back to colonialism, which explains why you kind of found some of that incline. So I just wondered if you had any thoughts you wanted to share about the framework, the kind of coloniality framework, and how that might help us think about different groups and their positioning in these broad scale histories.
Absolutely. So I'm trying to find this passage about Victoria, the founder of international law. And I may or may not be able to find it, Michelle. I'm looking at my index. But
Page 28 or 29.
28, yeah, for Angi. Okay, so one of the things that I began with was just saying, like, people want to think about the theoretical lock of the rights of man against the historical lock, right? Who is the colonial administrator? And there's a lot of work in political theory that says, hey, you can't separate those two things that are, in a way, one and the same. And so that is in the context of Anglo settlement. But the story that we're told about the emergence of international law is a story that is often traced to 1648 and the Treaty of Westphalia, right? The idea that suddenly, with the signing of this treaty, each individual nation state has sovereignty over determining its own religion. And scholars like Tim and Roscola, from Schmidt to Roscola, say, hey, 1648 is kind of late. It's not about the mitigation of violence within Europe. We actually have to trace this moment to 1492 with the discovery of the New World and the externalization of that violence into other lands, precisely for the consolidation of the family of nations. So that's really the long, wide historical frame out of which the problem of the unequal distribution of life, liberty, and property through the politics of repair emerge in the context of New World discovery. And so Anthony Angi, who's in Singapore, a law professor in Singapore and Utah, he writes about Victoria, and he says, commenting, what does he say? International law, such as it existed in Victoria's time, did not precede and thereby effortlessly resolve the problem of Spanish-Indian relations. Rather, international law was created out of the unique issues generated between the Spanish and the Indian. And so, going back to our discussion of the unthought subject, right? It's not that this world is created, right? And then you insert these subjects into it, but our very kind of epistemological framing of law, the apprehension of the new world, is done in tandem. And that co-constitutive act, the
Yes.
story of origins that we tell ourselves, the auto institution, as you say with Sylvia Wynter, that's done by burying certain histories and burying certain subjects. And
You could
maybe
even
that's one way
say,
to think about the unthought in relation to that larger frame.
that's right. You could even say the encounter is what produces the need to figure out how to create something that is going to do this double move of disavowal and and creation, right? Of a subject, of a set of laws, right? That the very encounter itself is kind of generative, right? What I love about even the move you make when you remind us that Locke was a colonial administrator is how much of this is real so if it's relationships at the end, it's also relationships at the beginning, right? It's real encounters and real social structures and hence why the subject of history, the history of the these are real subjects interacting and trying to reconcile a set of good things, bad things, and things they don't want to deal with, right?
And to go back to our discussion of adversary and aggressor from the beginning, so much of this encounter is predicated on violence, Michelle. Right. So we can't say that, discovery, in other words, and New World settlement is another word for the problem of violence and the justification or the defense of violence. And so to think about then in the wake of that, if reparation becomes a key word for understanding what that history of violence is, not as solution, but as ground for understanding that constitutive history, then I think we understand how there are certain subjects that are produced out of that violent encounter who then must become unthought.
Mm-hmm.
Just a little footnote. I thought I was prepared for your analysis of Locke as a slaveholder and all the rest, but I was unprepared for the analysis of Klein and the way in which she too sort of thinks who is part of the community and who is not part of who is othered and who is not. I was totally unprepared for that connection to the historical moment in which she's writing. I just hadn't, when I read it, I thought I was really taken aback. I think
I should have talked about that more at the lunch table. I mean, I'm going to read that one passage because this is the moment, I think, where we're getting to this problem. Like, how do you solve this, right? So she, says that.
What page are you on?
This is on page 43, okay? So she says, the child's early aggression stimulated the drive to restore and to make good, to put back into his mother the good things he had robbed her of in fantasy. And these wishes to make good merge into the later drive to explore. For by finding new land, the explorer gives something to the world at large and to a number of people in particular. The explorer gives something to the world at large and to a number of people in particular. In his pursuit, the explorer actually gives expression to both aggression and the drive to reparation, right? Violence and repair. We know that in discovering a new country, aggression is made of in the use of struggle with the elements and in overcoming difficulties of all kinds. But sometimes aggression is shown more openly, especially was this so in former times when ruthless cruelty against the native populations was displayed by people who not only explored but conquered and colonized. Some of the early fantasied attacks against the imaginary babies in their mother's body and actual hatred against newborn brothers and sisters were here expressed in reality. In reality, by the attitude toward the natives.
No, it's just
The wished for restoration, however, found full expression in repopulating the country with people of their own nationality. So that it's the however. It's the however that provides an ethical moment. So she says, the wish for restoration, however, found full expression in repopulating the country with people of their own nationality. So the however could be like, this is the historical reality of the situation, right? It was populated and now we've become, a white nation based on white supremacy, right? Or the however could also be a moment of ethical recognition.
Right.
The wish for restoration, however, found full expression in repopulating the country with people of their own nationality when that restoration could have or should have gone to others. So there's an ethical ambivalence in Klein. And I would say that that is the one sentence where, Michelle, your question of where the unthought emerges and how the unthought has to circulate both on the good and the bad side of Klein in terms of good and bad objects, that's where it is, right? So there's a glimmer of recognition, or you could say that that is the moment of the production of the unthought. And that those are the moments that we, right, as people who are concerned both about history, the subject of history and the history of the subject, we need to find those moments, because I think it's in those moments where those polarizations, those binaries can come apart, because this is a polarization and a binary, but it also could be its undoing.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, it's really, I think, I think it's probably time to move to questions because we're running out of time, and I think there are probably a lot of questions.
Are there questions, Ken?
Are there any
There are
questions,
some
Ken?
excellent questions.
Oh, okay.
Some serious questions, which is really impressive. This first one's from Gail Hamner. What a fabulous discussion and a wonderful, eminently teachable book. I'd be grateful if Professor Eng would expound further on the status of absolute in his notion of absolute apology. Chapter 3. In a world driven by large entities that we keep hoping will just go away, state apparatuses, media moguls, shrill hate mongering, politicos, how does the relative whisper of face-to-face absolute apology land historically, politically, socially? Can it register at all? Or does it matter if it doesn't register? Or perhaps not registering is the point? Does the moment of absolute apology equate to the moment unthought subjects encounter each other, and that's sufficient? And she says, I think Professor Scott just answered that, just asked that.
Well, I was going to say this is a better formulation than mine was, but so I thank you for that question.
Okay, I will explain my notion of absolute. And then I would actually want to kind of brainstorm with Michelle and Joan about what are the. I mean, I think we've already talked about the relative translatability of that, but I think this question is pushing us to consider it further. So, as far as absolute is concerned, I was thinking about Derrida in this chapter because he has a concept of absolute forgiveness. And he says, in his really beautiful deconstructive way, the only thing worth forgiving is the unforgivable. If you can forgive something, then it's not worth it, right? So it's only the absolute unforgivable that is worth forgiving. But even if you forgive, you have to do so without expectation of apology. So that's the secret, right, of forgiveness. Because he says if you get caught into a dynamic of apology and forgiveness, it just becomes politics, right? What Joan referred to earlier. And so it really was from his notion of absolute forgiveness that I started to think about the situation of the Sate Dene and say, hey, if absolute forgiveness is forgiving that which is unforgivable, maybe absolute apology is apologizing for that which you are not quite responsible. So that's the theoretical crux of that absolute apology and absolute forgiveness. The absolutes that are attached to the polarization of politics that we face today, that is not, that's not the same absolute at all. And I think that that's one key point to make. I think that the question of what is that translatability is something that we have actually talked about in terms of the mismatch between law and psychoanalysis. We've talked about that as the way in which two unthought subjects can address one another. We've talked about that as maybe there is a no state solution and we have to turn to other areas outside of state sovereignty to imagine what an ethics of repair might look like. So that's to me just kind of like a recap of our discussion in relation to the question. But whether or not it should be have some kind of direct connection to politics or not, I don't have an immediate answer to that. I don't know, Michelle, your audio is still on, so maybe you have something to say about it.
I mean, not an answer. I did, I don't know if this is gonna quite, I read Vamik Volkan's Enemies, I think it was Enemies on the Couch. And Vamik Volkan is a psychoanalyst who back in the day participated in a number of types of negotiation talks between different international population state entities that were including in Israel, Gaza, Palestine, Jordan, Egypt, right? Different kinds of scenarios. And again, I can't say that it's an answer. It was a book that left me ambivalent because there was something about, on the one hand, just hearing the work of being in the rooms attempting to get people to talk and what you would have to be armed with psychologically and kind of spiritually, but in a broad, like small s spiritually, like what kind of sensibility about the human, not just the good in the human, but the bad in the human, you'd have to engage in those talks. So I was kind of blown away and impressed with just the work of it, as much as the narrative was about many failures, many, the kind of the car crash of history, right? And so, like I said, it's not, that's what I have that I'm holding on to right now. And that's what I was holding on to about your phrase, you cannot repair injury, you can only repair relationships. It's like a truism that means little except in the doing of it, it's like a rung to hold on to, but you still have to do it. And probably 8 times out of 10, it may fail because of where humans are, right? But that's kind of where I am right now, trying to hold, or what I'm trying to hold.
The next question comes from Greg Rizzolo, who's editor at JAPA. Thank you for this evocative dialogue. My question is about how repair works, following up on Joan's question about how change happens. In Klein, repair is healing for the subject, who, in splitting the object, also split the self into good and bad parts. It sounds like you're extending healing to the recipient of repair. Can you say more about this move? It seems like an important and original contribution.
Thanks, Greg. So a lot of the work in reparation and the thinking and the theorizing of reparation has come out both of psychoanalytic circles and literary circles. And, so I think about Eve Sedgwick, and going back to our discussion of the prior question, Sedgwick turns to reparation as a kind of response to the paranoid splitting position of psychoanalysis. And of course, when you think about the subject, these are not stages, these are cycles, right? You go through paranoid splitting, you go through reparation, and then manic, you go through the depressive position. And then if you get through that, you go to reparation, and then the cycle begins all again. Sedgwick is writing in the wake of the AIDS movement. And so she's trying to find, again, some kind of hope in the problem of reparation. And I think the second generation of folks have brought up this problem, right, of repair as not just having a kind of potential salutary effect, but in our whole discussion today, trying to historicize reparation and its kind of unthought effects. It's untalked about history. So one of the critiques, of course, is that reparation is completely one-sided. It has nothing to do with the other, right? It has nothing to do with the other. Like, you're repairing yourself. And in fact, in my reading of Klein, we get to this notion that it's not that morality is the cause of reparation. What I call colonial morality is the effect of reparation, right? That it's a colonial morality through the act of repair that creates a boundary between self and other, where the self is repaired, the self is both victim and perpetrator, and the other is just unthought, right? So that's one way of actually reframing, I think, Greg's question in relation to the larger historical landscape that we're talking about. I think that the Dene are interesting because that example is not just about giving an account of oneself, but it's about the recognition of the other. And so that would get us into an example where the kind of psychoanalytic protocol of repairing the self actually has salutarious effects on the other.
Interestingly, there's a question from Nicole Shippen. I'm curious why you do not frame the Satu Dene as acting as a sovereign nation in their actions.
Oh, actually, I do. I talk about in chapter 3. I can't get into all of the sovereignty debates, but in Indigenous studies. And you know what I found interesting about all of our work, Michelle, your work, Joan, your work, is like what's great about the humanities and great about, I guess, we're not hard scientists, is like our projects become bigger and bigger and more expansive as we get older. And in a way, that last chapter is as much about the Cold War as it is about Asian American studies, as it is about psychoanalysis and law, as it has to be about Indigenous studies. But I'm not an Indigenous studies scholar. But I also feel that, I have done enough homework to say something about the Satu Dene. So one of the things I do say in chapter 3 is that I'm full recognition of all the sovereignty debates that are going on in the field. But this book is not the one that's going to be addressing and adjudicating that. The Dene are both part and apart from Canada. They are both sovereign and not sovereign. And so they have what, Audra Simpson would call nested sovereignties. And so I actually do talk about the way in which those nested sovereignties have a kind of useful effect insofar as, with James Scott, he talks about the art of not being governed outside of state sovereignty. And I say there's an interesting way in which these overlapping sovereignties with the Satu Dene and Canada is the art of not being governed within sovereignty. So that's how, that's a more, I guess, detailed explanation of how I treat the problem of sovereignty and indigenous nations in chapter 3.
Christine Schmidt asks, in an attempt to demonstrate the possibility of reparations for subjects whose humanity hasn't been recognized by the state, people of African descent in the US, I've introduced organizational frameworks for racial repair based on the UN definition for reparations, rehabilitation, restitution, compensation, etc. After reading your book, I think this may not work. So I continue to search for a practice of repair in the absence of state recognition of harm. Comment, please, if my dilemma is clear to you. It's a practical question for psychoanalytic training programs.
Ken, I don't see that. I'm having one of those like senior moments where I'm trying to look.
It's actually, the person wrote it in the chat.
Oh, okay.
We
I
asked them
kind of
to
need
put
to
it in the
read
chat.
it along with.
Sorry.
So let me just read this.
I thought of asking them to move it and then thought, it's right there. I can read it. Sorry.
So let me read it again because, I'm having one of those cognitive dissonant moments. Okay. In an attempt to demonstrate the possibility of reparations for subjects whose humanity has been recognized by the state, people of African descent in the US, I've introduced organizational frameworks for racial repair based on the UN definition for reparations, rehabilitation, compensation, etc. After reading the book, I think this may not work. So I continue to search for a practice of repair in the absence of state recognition of harm. Comment, please, if my dilemma is clear to you. It's a practical question. Yeah, your question is, Christine, very clear to me. And what I would say is it's not an either or. It's a both and response that I would give you, which is to say that I do not want to come off in this book as saying that victims and perpetrators are relative, right? There are many legal situations like the Holocaust, like what's going on in Gaza with the atomic bombings, where the law actually the UN needs to make a strong distinction, right, of injury and mechanisms of repair. I think that the key thing that I'm saying is that that's not where it ends, that's maybe only where it begins, because it is sure to leave something out. Okay. And what it leaves out is not just the limits of repair, but it leaves out the unthought subject, right? That Michelle and Joan and I have been talking about over the course of this hour and a half. And so I think that imagining how legal institutions both work in tandem with the psychoanalytic questions of injury and harm and violence that we're talking about is key, but it's as key to think of them separately from one another, right? So I think that as much as all of us here are really interested in psychoanalysis, so we've talked a lot about, the way in which psychoanalysis has impacted the problem of history, but we also have talked about the way in which the problem of history has impacted psychoanalysis. And so I take your kind of question and that mismatch to be in that intersection.
So this leads nicely into the last question we have, and then maybe people can make some last remarks. This is Nayanika Mukherjee, who's written on great harms with a lot of insight. I have your book here, David. I'm looking forward to reading it. Really enjoyed the fantastic discussion. I've written on irreconciliation, various forms of non-forgiveness, which I've explored as something that is not opposed to peace or equal to vengeance. Irreconciliation instead allows us to interrogate the status quo by refusing to forgive endemic impunities, particularly in the aftermath of staged processes of justice and the presence of the rule of law. I was wondering what your thoughts are about non-forgiveness, irreconciliation, as in a lot of ways apology and forgiveness are normative. Was that Josephides? I don't know the name, I assume that's correct. Explores the role of forced forgiveness and explored this relationship through a critical reading of Derrida and Ricoeur. Would appreciate your thoughts on this, David, and the other panelists, if possible.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for that question, Nayanika. So for me, actually, the mismatch that we get in absolute apology, absolute forgiveness, to go back to Derrida, is the irreconcilability, right? That the apology, the absolute forgiveness in the absence of a demand for apology, and the absolute apology in the absence of demand for forgiveness, those to me are about maintaining an irreconcilability. I also do think that, when you move into the politics of apology and repair, then the problem that you raise of the non-commensurate, the irreconcilable, is all the more important because, it's one of the things that I say at the end of the introduction. Psychic temporalities of trauma, loss, and suffering do not operate through the logics of juridical and financial accountability, nor then can they be resolved by sovereign authority of the nation state and its self-determined liberal subjects. And that's where I say, ultimately, if the past is irreparable, then a reconceptualized notion of reparations must concern itself in the present with creating the conditions of possibility for just futures and for new relationalities to be sustained. I think the irreconcilable creates that tension and demands that response.
Joan, Michelle, do you have any final thoughts?
Sure, I just have one, which would take us in a whole different direction. But I was thinking when we were talking, and actually when I read your book, of David Scott, the anthropologist at Columbia's work on reparative history, in which he argues that the history of slavery can never be repaired, but that a reparative history would be writing the history to reveal all of the things that that enslavement meant, so that it's writing the history of these relationships that somehow has the function not of forgiveness or of apology, but of it's reparative in the sense that it makes the record clearer about what the dehumanization that you talk about, David, is actually involved. And I mean, it would be a whole other discussion, but I think there is the thing you raised about my sort of pessimism, I mean, I think it's in writing these histories that I find some redemptive or hopeful or possible uh, possible way of addressing the questions that you raise. And I think your treatment of the Dene is an example of that, actually.
I think for me, I'm going to say something kind of parallel. My two fields, you could say, Black studies and psychoanalysis, right? Clinically, and then kind of in the Black tradition, right? Has been, for me, the moments of hope come when something is named. You know, like I think the Black tradition has been about a set of kind of disqualified knowledges that we have been producing about our unthought experience for centuries, whether it's in slave narratives or philosophical treatises or whatever. And so and what has created a certain kind of aliveness in the Black tradition is the naming of our experience. And as a psychoanalyst, you know, in some of the most, you know, difficult moments, being able to try to formulate something that has been formulated, right? And the irreconcilable could be described. You can't reconcile it, but there is something about formulating the irreconcilable, right? And that for me is what I feel you have done with this notion of repair is captured some of the elements of it that were not formulated, that are shaping something about our historical moment. And just in the naming of that, again, it doesn't solve it, doesn't resolve it, but it somehow formulates something that gives you a new way of, it allows for thinking, you know. And as a psychoanalyst, and as a Black studies scholar, I know in both of my hats, being able to think is what makes us alive, right? You know, there are so many forces clamping thought right now, right? So for me, that I think is what is so it's parallel in a sense to how I find reparation, you could say, or how I find hope, you know.
It's what you said earlier about open spaces, looking for the openings and creating the open spaces in which we can think these things. And we could say that this book does that.
You know, I'm gonna just say one last quick thing, Ken, and also just deeply, deeply thank all of you for your just amazing engagement with this work. I think the irreconcilable is in the unthought. If it's unthought, it can never be reconciled. And so, you know, that's my kind of closing idea, that if we bring the problem of the irreconcilable to the problem of the unthought, we are faced with that dilemma. But I also say one thing in the book, which I think points, right, to the need to name these experiences, whether it's in Black studies, Asian American studies, and psychoanalysis, which is, I say that when the sovereignty of the nation state is on the line and the victorious nation state holds priority and sway over everything else, then what we often see is a proliferating chain of victims in the absence of any identifiable perpetrator. Right? So it's those moments where there's an irreconcilability that actually might be generative and productive, and it might turn us to that problem of the unthought, the not me, right? Or the naming, or the demand for the creating and the naming of an experience that hitherto hasn't emerged.
This has
Thank you,
been
David.
really fantastic. Thank you all so much. This is like clearly the intellectual public's mode that just when you get to the end, you're really at the new start, and we could have like a whole other hour. It's really fantastic. I really appreciate your generosity, David, and yours, Michelle and Jones, and the openness to the discussion and the kind of closeness of the thinking, which is something, you know, at a time where things could go off in many large and open directions. The kind of focus here, I think, just gives everybody something really huge to take away. So thank you all very much. Thanks for everybody who tuned in, and really appreciate you. We'll be back next month with Ron Rodano and his book on the production of jazz and excess value through American history, which is going to be really cool. And everybody have a really great night, and thanks so much. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye-bye.
Del, thanks, Joan. Thanks, Ken. Thanks, Leslie. Bye.